The glass walls of Haile Couture's Manhattan headquarters stretched upward like a cathedral of ambition, reflecting the city's restless pulse under a sky bruised with rain clouds. On the top floor, 70 stories above the clamor of taxis and dreams, Margaret Hale sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, her silver hair catching the cold glow of recessed lights. At 62, she was the undisputed queen of high fashion, a CEO whose name adorned billboards and glossy magazines. Tonight, the boardroom buzzed with the low hum of power. Shareholders in tailored suits, their voices sharp with numbers and expectations. But beneath her crisp navy blazer and the steely resolve in her hazel eyes, Margaret felt an emptiness she couldn't name. On the table, beneath a stack of financial reports, lay a framed photo of Lily, her 17-year-old daughter. The glass was smudged, the edges dulled by neglect. Margaret's fingers brushed it briefly as she adjusted the papers, a fleeting touch she didn't acknowledge. She hadn't looked at that photo, really looked at it, in months. Lily's wide, hopeful eyes stared out from a memory of a picnic, years ago, a rare day when Margaret had let the world wait. Now it was buried under profit margins and deadlines, just as Lily herself often was. Q4 projections are slipping. Margaret? Richard Klein drawled from across the table, his voice smooth but edged with a challenge. A rival shareholder with a shark smile, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. The press is sniffing around. They're saying, "Haile Couture's lost its edge. What's your move?" Margaret's jaw tightened, but her expression remained a mask of control. She'd built this empire from nothing, Brooklyn tenements to boardroom triumphs, and she'd never flinched under pressure. "My move," she said, her tone clipped and deliberate, "is to remind them who I am. We'll launch the spring. Line early. Double the ad spend. They'll eat out of my hand by March." The room nodded, placated, but Richard's smirk lingered. Margaret ignored it, her mind already racing ahead to the next meeting, the next crisis. She didn't build Haile Couture to be questioned. She didn't claw her way up to let emotion, or anyone, drag her back down. Her phone buzzed against the table, a soft vibration that cut through the hum of voices. A text from Lily. "Mom, can you come home early tonight? I'm waiting." Margaret's thumb hovered over the screen, her chest tightening for a split second. She saw Lily in her mind, curled on the penthouse sofa, probably baking those lopsided cookies she loved, her dark hair spilling over a book. A flicker of warmth stirred in Margaret, but she extinguished it fast. Later, she told herself. There's always later. "I didn't build this company to be pulled back by feelings," she murmured to her assistant Claire, who hovered nearby with a tablet. Claire nodded, used to the mantra, but Margaret's hand lingered on Lily's photo a moment too long before she shoved it aside. "Dan tien kong cho joy ai," she added under her breath, a Vietnamese phrase she'd picked up from her mother long ago. Reputation waits for no one. It was her shield, her creed. The meeting dragged on, numbers blurring into a rhythm of power and control. By the time it ended, the rain had thickened outside, slashing against the glass like a warning. Margaret stood, smoothing her blazer, and dismissed the room with a nod. She was untouchable, until she wasn't. The drive home was a blur of wet streets and neon lights, the city's pulse syncing with her own. She gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black Mercedes, the leather cool against her palms. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Lily, but Margaret didn't look. She couldn't. Not now. The spring line, Richard's taunts, the weight of her legacy, they pressed down harder than any plea from her daughter. Then it happened. A fleeting thought of Lily's cookies, those uneven, chocolate-streaked disasters, slipped through her defenses. Her lips twitched, almost a smile, and for a moment, she reached for her phone. Just a call. Just to say she'd be home soon. But the rain-slicked road had other plans. A truck swerved ahead, its horn blaring, and Margaret yanked the wheel too late. Metal screamed against metal, glass shattered, and the world spun into darkness. She didn't feel the impact, not fully. Consciousness flickered like a dying bulb, Lily's voice calling, "Mom," the scent of cookies, the cold bite of regret. Then nothing. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire through Manhattan's elite circles. Fashion queen Margaret Hale in coma after crash, the headlines screamed. Reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing outside the hospital where paramedics had rushed her. Gossip columns pounced. The Ice Queen falls. Who'll mourn her? Twitter lit up with snide remarks. Guess she couldn't buy her way out of this one. The world she'd ruled with an iron grip turned on her, mocking the empire she'd sacrificed everything for. Inside the hospital, Margaret lay still, her breathing shallow, her pristine blazer replaced by a sterile gown. The woman who'd never bent under pressure was now a figure of fragility, her legacy teetering on the edge of ruin. And somewhere in a penthouse high above the city, Lily waited alone, her cookies cooling on the counter, her phone clutched tight with no reply. Margaret had always believed undue honor was her crown, forged in boardrooms and headlines. She'd controlled every step, every emotion, to keep it gleaming. But as rain hammered the hospital roof and the city whispered her name, a deeper truth loomed in the shadows. Honor built on solitude might be no honor at all. The private hospital, sweet smelled of antiseptic and money, a sterile sanctuary carved out for Manhattan's elite. Soft light spilled from sconces along the walls, casting a muted glow over the polished hardwood floor. Outside, rain drummed relentlessly against the tall windows, a restless rhythm that mirrored the hum of machines monitoring Margaret Hale's fragile pulse. She lay motionless on the bed, her silver hair fanned across the pillow, a queen stripped of her crown. Tubes snaked from her arms, and the faint beep of a heart monitor was the only sign she still clung to life. Down the hall, in a waiting area reserved for family, Lily Hale sat alone. 17, with her mother's sharp cheekbones and a quiet resilience all her own, she curled into a leather chair, her knees drawn up. Her dark hair spilled over a hoodie, too casual for the Hale name, but she didn't care. In her lap, a phone screen glowed with unanswered texts. "Mom, I'm here. Please wake up." Her fingers trembled as she typed another, then deleted it. The cookies she'd baked sat forgotten in the penthouse, their warmth long gone. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, steady and unhurried. Lily glanced up, expecting a nurse or a doctor in crisp whites. Instead, a man stood there, 30 maybe, with a lean frame swallowed by a threadbare coat. His brown hair was damp from the rain, clinging to his forehead, and his hands clutched a small metal tin. He didn't belong here, not in this world of tailored suits and whispered wealth. Yet his eyes, deep, steady, hazel like Margaret's, held a quiet strength that stopped Lily's breath. "You're Lily, right?" he asked, his voice low and warm, cutting through the sterile silence. He stepped closer, offering the tin. "I brought you something. Figured you might be hungry." Lily blinked, her guard snapping up. "Who are you?" she said, her tone sharp but brittle. Strangers didn't just walk into private wings of Mount Sinai with food and familiarity, especially not for a Hale. "Name's Sam," he replied, unfazed by her suspicion. He set the tin on the table beside her, popping the lid to reveal a stack of homemade bread rolls still warm, flecked with rosemary. The scent hit her like a memory, her mother's kitchen, a rare Sunday years ago. "Your mom liked these. Thought you might too." Her eyes narrowed. "How do you know what my mom likes?" The question hung heavy, laced with a mix of fear and curiosity. She clutched her phone tighter, as if it could shield her from this stranger's unsettling calm. Sam hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor for a heartbeat before lifting again. "Someone who loved her told me," he said simply, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. Sorrow, maybe, or resolve. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Lily. Just didn't want you sitting here alone." The words landed softly, but they stirred a storm in her chest. Alone. She'd been alone, all night, waiting for a mother who might never wake up while the world outside spun tales of Margaret Hale's downfall. The tabloids were already circling. "Heir to Hale Couture abandoned in crisis," they'd write, twisting her pain into headlines. And now this man, this Sam, stood here like he knew her, offering bread and cryptic answers. "Why, do you care?" she pressed, her voice cracking despite her effort to hold it together. "You don't even know me." Sam's lips curved into a faint, sad smile. "I don't need to know you to see you're hurting," he said. "And I don't need a title to sit with someone who's scared. That's all I'm offering, take it or leave it." Lily stared at him, torn between shoving him away and clinging to the first shred of kindness she'd felt since the crash. The bread's warmth seeped into the air, a quiet rebellion against the hospital's chill. She reached for a roll, her fingers brushing the tin, and took a tentative bite. It was simple, rustic, nothing like the gourmet fare of her mother's world, but it tasted like comfort, like home. "Thanks," she muttered, barely audible, her eyes flicking to his coat. A glint of silver caught her attention. A ring, half tucked in his pocket, its familiar curve sparking a memory she couldn't place. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a fragment from years ago. "I gave it away to someone who mattered." Before she could ask, a nurse bustled in, clipboard in hand. "Miss Hale, we've stabilized her, but she's still critical. You should rest." The woman glanced at Sam, frowning. "And you are?" "Just a friend," Sam said, stepping back, hands raised slightly, as if to prove he meant no harm. The nurse didn't press, too busy to care, and left them in silence again. Lily turned the ring over in her mind, her pulse quickening. "You're not just a friend," she said, more to herself than to him. "How do you really know her?" Sam didn't flinch, didn't falter. He met her gaze with that same steady calm, a man who'd faced worse than her questions and come out whole. "Someone had to watch out for you," he said. "That's all you need to know for now." The words hung there, heavy with unspoken truth. Lily wanted to push, to demand answers, but exhaustion weighed her down. She sank back into the chair, the roll still warm in her hand, and let his presence settle around her like a shield. Outside, the rain pounded on, but in that hallway, Sam's quiet dignity held the chaos at bay. He didn't ask for recognition, didn't demand trust. He just stayed, unseen by the world that mocked Margaret's fall, unnoticed by the headlines that would soon scream, "Mystery man comforts Hale heiress." To them, he was a nobody. To Lily, he was a lifeline she didn't yet understand, and somewhere in the depths of Margaret's silence, a past she'd buried stirred, waiting to rise. Hospital room faded into a haze as Margaret Hale's mind slipped from the sterile present into the grip of memory. The steady beep of the heart monitor blurred into the hum of a different time, a time when her world was smaller, grittier, and infinitely heavier. She was 25 again, standing in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, the air thick with the scent of yeast and desperation. Rain streaked the single window, a gray curtain over a life she'd vowed to escape. Her silver hair was dark then, her hands unmarred by years of boardroom battles, but her eyes already carried the steel of a woman who'd learned to control everything, especially herself. In her arms, a boy clung to her skirt, 5 years old, with hazel eyes too big for his thin face. Sam. His name echoed in her chest now, a quiet ache she'd buried beneath decades of success. Beside them stood his mother, Ellen, a woman of quiet strength, her apron dusted with flour from the bread she'd baked that morning. The loaf sat cooling on the table, its crust cracked and golden, a simple offering in a home teetering on the edge of collapse. "You don't have to do this, Margaret," Ellen said, her voice steady but pleading. She wiped her hands on the apron, leaving faint streaks of white. "He needs you. We can make it work. Together." Margaret's grip tightened on Sam's small shoulder, his warmth seeping through her thin blouse. She wanted to believe Ellen, wanted to stay in that kitchen, with its peeling paint and flickering bulb. But beyond the window loomed a city of glass and gold, a world where power waited for those bold enough to seize it. She'd tasted poverty, its bitter sting, its relentless grind, and she'd sworn never to let it define her. Honor, she told herself, was rising above. Dignity was never bending. "I'll come back," Margaret said, her voice firm, though her throat burned. "When I've made something of myself. When I can give him more than this." She gestured at the cracked walls, the second-hand furniture, as if they were chains she could break. "I can't be a mother and a winner, Ellen. Not yet." Ellen's eyes darkened, but she didn't argue. She knelt, pulling Sam close, whispering something Margaret couldn't hear over the rain. The boy's gaze followed her as she stepped toward the door, his small hand reaching out, then falling. "Mama?" he called, tentative, a question she didn't answer. She left them there, Ellen's bread on the table, Sam's quiet trust in her return, and stepped into the storm. The city swallowed her whole, and she let it. She traded Brooklyn's shadows for Manhattan's gleam, building haute couture from scraps of ambition and sleepless nights. She told herself it was for Sam, for a future where he'd never know hunger. But the years stretched on, and the promise faded into a lie she stopped repeating. Now in the hospital bed, that memory clawed its way back. Margaret's chest tightened as the scene shifted. Years later, a sterile office at Haute Couture, her name etched in gold on the door. She was 35, a rising star, when Ellen's letter arrived. The envelope was worn, the handwriting shaky. "Sam's sick. I can't afford the doctor. Please, Margaret, help us." A photo slipped out, a boy, older now, thinner, his eyes still searching for her. She'd stared at it, her fingers trembling, then slid it into a drawer. "I can't," she'd whispered to the empty room. "I can't let them see me weak." Weakness was failure, and failure was dishonor. She sent no reply, no money, no sign she'd ever known them. Ellen's plea became another shadow she locked away, a price paid for the pedestal she'd climbed. With Lily, it was different, or so she told herself. Born years later to a fleeting marriage with a Wall Street broker, Lily was the child Margaret kept, the one she molded into a Hale. She gave her penthouses and private schools, but never the messy, unguarded love Sam had once known. Lily was proof Margaret wasn't heartless, a polished shield against the past. Yet even that shield had cracks. Missed recitals, silent dinners, a daughter who begged for time Margaret wouldn't give. The hospital's hum snapped her back, a jolt of reality through the fog of memory. Margaret's eyes fluttered, unfocused, as a voice pierced the silence, Lily's voice raw and trembling. "Mom, please wake up, I need you." It came from beside the bed, where Lily sat, her hands clasped tight, tears streaking her face. The sound was a blade, slicing through the armor Margaret had worn for decades. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, but her mind reeled. Sam's mama echoed alongside Lily's plea, two voices from two lives she'd shaped, one abandoned, one neglected. The weight of it pressed down, heavier than any shareholder's scorn. She'd controlled every step, every emotion, to preserve her dignity, her don due. But what had it cost? Ellen's bread, Sam's trust, Lily's tears, they haunted her now, shadows she couldn't outrun. In that sterile room, Margaret Hale lay trapped between the woman she'd been and the one she'd become. Her empire stood tall, a monument to her self-discipline, but its foundations trembled. Honor, she'd thought, was never bending. Dignity was never breaking. Yet as Lily's sobs filled the air, a deeper truth flickered in the dark. True strength might lie in bending after all, not to weakness, but to love. The rain outside slowed to a whisper, and Margaret's pulse steadied, a fragile thread holding her to a past she couldn't erase. Somewhere in her silence, a boy's face lingered, hazel eyes, a hand reaching out. And with it, the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The penthouse perched atop a Manhattan tower was a fortress of glass and silence, its sleek lines softened only by the flicker of a fireplace. Rain lashed the floor-to-ceiling windows, a restless dance of water against wealth, while inside, Lily Hale sat cross-legged on a plush rug, her hoodie dwarfing her slender frame. The glow of the fire painted her face in shifting shadows, her dark eyes fixed on a battered wooden box she'd pulled from beneath her mother's bed. Beside her, Sam knelt, his worn coat draped over a chair, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Lily's fingers trembled as she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of yellowed envelopes, their edges curling with age. The handwriting on the top one was shaky but deliberate. To Margaret Hale, From Sam. She pulled it free, her breath catching as she unfolded the paper. The words were simple, scrawled in a child's uneven hand. Mom, I don't blame you. I just want you to be happy. Dated 30 years ago, it was signed with a lopsided heart. She looked up at Sam, her voice barely a whisper. This is you, isn't it? You're my brother. Sam's hazel eyes, too much like her mother's, met. Hers, steady and unguarded. He didn't flinch, didn't deny it, but he didn't confirm it either. Don't dig into things that can't be changed, Lily, he said, his tone soft but firm. I'm here now. That's what matters. The fire popped, sending a spark skittering across the hearth, and Lily's grip tightened on the letter. No, she said, her voice rising, raw with a mix of anger and need. You don't get to decide that. If you're my family, I deserve to know. Why are you here? Why now? Sam leaned back, resting his hands on his knees, his calm unshaken. Because you were alone, he said simply. When I heard about the crash, I couldn't let you face it by yourself. Not like... He stopped, his jaw tightening, then softened again. Not like I did. The words hung between them, heavy with a past Lily could only guess at. She tore through the box, pulling out more letters, dozens of them, spanning years. A 10-year-old Sam. I got an A in math today, Mom. I hope you're proud. A teenager. I saw you on TV. You looked strong. An adult. I don't need you to come back, just don't forget me. Each one was a thread, weaving a story Margaret had never shared. A boy reaching across decades for a mother who'd turned away. Lily's tears blurred the ink as she clutched a letter to her chest. If you're not my family, she said, her voice breaking, how do you know I loved it when Mom sang me to sleep? That old lullaby. Sleep, little one, the stars are near. She stopped singing it years ago. How do you know? Sam's gaze dropped to the fire, his hands clenching briefly before relaxing. She sang it to me too, he said so quietly, she almost missed it. Back when I was small, before she left. The admission landed like a stone, rippling through Lily's fragile world. She stood, pacing the rug, her hoodie sleeves swiping at her face. She left you? And you still wrote to her? You still came for me? Her voice cracked with disbelief, with awe. Why didn't you hate her? Sam rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his dignity intact despite the worn soles of his shoes. Hating her wouldn't change anything, he said. It wouldn't bring her back, wouldn't fix what broke. I wrote because I wanted her to know I was okay. I came because you're not okay, and you're worth more than her silence. Lily stopped, staring at him. This stranger who carried her mother's eyes and a lifetime of grace she couldn't fathom. The penthouse, with its marble counters and crystal chandeliers, felt hollow around them. Margaret's empire, built on ambition, not love. Outside, the rain howled, but inside, Sam's quiet strength held the space steady. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, a news alert lighting the screen. Mystery man at Hale Heiress's side, savior or scam. The media had caught wind of Sam, spinning their venom into headlines. Lily snatched it up, her hands shaking. They're calling you a liar, she said. They think you're after her money. Let them, Sam replied, his voice even, unshaken by the world's judgment. I've lived with worse. What matters is what you think. She sank back onto the rug, the letters scattered around her like fallen leaves. The firelight danced over them, illuminating a truth she couldn't unsee. Her mother had abandoned this man, her brother, and yet here he was, offering her bread, offering her company. When the world turned its back, she remembered Margaret's rare, fleeting softness, singing that lullaby, her voice a whisper against the dark. Had she sung it for Sam too, before she chose Hale Couture over him? I believe you, Lily said at last, her voice small, but resolute. I don't care what they say. You're not a scam. You're real. She clutched the first letter again, the one with the heart, and looked at him. She should have kept you. Sam's smile was faint, tinged with a sadness he didn't voice. She made her choice, he said. I made mine. And you don't have to be alone in hers. The wind rattled the windows, carrying whispers of a city that thrived on scandal. But in that penthouse, amid the relics of a fractured family, Lily felt a shift. Sam's presence wasn't just a lifeline. It was a mirror, reflecting a dignity Margaret had lost, a self-respect forged in resilience, not riches. The letters fluttered in the draft, each one a plea unanswered, but Sam's quiet stand answered something deeper. Outside, the storm raged on, and the media spun their tales. Inside, Lily held onto a brother she'd never known, and the first threads of a buried past began to weave themselves into light. The hospital room was a cocoon of muted luxury, its walls lined with pale wood, and its air tinged with the faint hum of wealth, private care for a woman who'd ruled Manhattan's fashion elite. Margaret Hale lay propped against crisp white pillows, her silver hair stark against the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy with the fog of sedation, but sharp enough to register the world she'd left behind. Tubes snaked from her arm, and the steady beep of the heart monitor marked her return from the edge. Outside, rain streaked the windows, a relentless curtain over a city that never slept. She wasn't alone. At the foot of her bed stood Claire, her assistant, clutching a tablet with a screen full of headlines. Beside her loomed Richard Klein, the rival shareholder whose smirk had haunted boardroom battles for years. His tailored suit gleamed under the lights, his presence a calculated intrusion. And there by her side was Lily, 17, fragile yet fierce, her dark eyes red-rimmed but unyielding, a wooden box of letters clutched in her lap. "Margaret, thank God," Claire said, her voice clipped with relief. "The board's in a panic. The stock's dipping, 10% since the crash. We need a statement." Margaret's throat burned as she swallowed, her mind clawing back to control. She'd built Hale Couture with her bare hands, her dandu, her honor, forged in every stitch, every deal. She wouldn't let it crumble now. "Draft it," she rasped, her voice weak but firm. "I'm fine. Business as usual." Richard chuckled, a low, grating sound. "Fine? The press is having a field day, Margaret. Ice Queen in Coma, heiress left to strangers. And this?" He gestured at Lily, then at the door where Sam had last been seen. "This nobody hanging around your daughter? They're calling him a gold digger. You need to shut it down." Lily stiffened, her grip tightening on the box. "He's not a nobody," she snapped, her voice trembling with defiance. "He's been here for me when no one else was." Margaret's gaze flicked to Lily, then to the box, a flicker of unease stirring beneath her composure. She'd seen Sam's face in the haze of memory, those hazel eyes, that quiet strength. But she'd pushed it away, a shadow she couldn't afford to face. "Who is he?" she asked, her tone measured, though her pulse quickened. Lily hesitated, then opened the box, pulling out a letter. The paper trembled in her hands as she read aloud. "Mom, I don't blame you. I just want you to be happy. It's from Sam, 30 years ago. He's your son, Mom, my brother." The room fell, silent, the words a thunderclap in the sterile air. Richard's smirk faltered, then widened into something predatory. "Your son?" he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Oh, this is rich. The great Margaret Hale, hiding a bastard kid while she built her throne. The board will love this." Margaret's chest tightened, but she kept her face a mask of steel. She'd spent decades controlling every narrative, every emotion to preserve her dignity. This, Sam, the letters, the past, was a crack she couldn't let widen. "He's not my son," she said, her voice cold, cutting. "He's a stranger, a coincidence, nothing more." Lily's eyes widened, hurt flashing across her face. "You're lying," she said, her voice breaking. "I saw the letters. He wrote to you for years and you ignored him. He's here now, Mom. He stayed with me when you couldn't. And you're throwing him away again?" Richard crossed his arms, his glee barely contained. "Deny it all you want, Margaret. But the press won't care. They've got photos. Him with Lily, coming and going. One whisper of this, and Haile Couture's done. You'll look weak, sentimental, a fraud. End it now. Disown him publicly or I'll make sure the board does it for you. The threat hung heavy, a blade poised over her legacy. Margaret's mind raced, calculating the cost. She'd built her empire on discipline, on never. Bending, not to poverty, not to please, not to love. Sam was a ghost from a life she'd buried, a boy she'd left to protect her honor. To claim him now would unravel everything, her reputation, her control, her dandu. Richard would twist it, the media would feast, and Haile Couture would bleed. Mom, please, Lily said, her voice softer now, a plea. She set the box on the bed, letters spilling out like secrets too long kept. He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted me to be okay. Don't do this to him again. Margaret's eyes fell on the letters, the childish scrawl piercing through her armor. I don't blame you. The words echoed from Brooklyn, from a kitchen she'd fled, from a boy she'd promised to return for. She saw Ellen's face, steady, pleading, and felt the weight of a choice she'd justified for decades. Her hand twitched toward the box, then stilled. Get him out, she said at last, her voice a blade of ice. He's no one to us. Claire, draft the statement. Richard, handle the board. This ends here. Lily gasped, tears spilling over. You're wrong, she whispered, backing away. You're throwing away the only person who didn't give up on us. She turned and fled, the box tumbling to the floor, letters scattering like leaves in a storm. Richard nodded, satisfied. Smart move, Margaret. Keep your crown. He left, his footsteps fading into the hum of the hospital. Alone, Margaret stared at the scattered letters, her breath shallow. The rain outside roared, a mirror to the chaos she'd silenced within. She'd controlled it, kept her dignity intact, her empire safe. But Lily's words lingered, sharp as glass. You're throwing him away again. And beneath the surface a memory stirred. Ellen's bread, Sam's small hand. A promise unkept. Her honor held firm. A fortress unbreached. Yet in the quiet, with Lily's sobs echoing in her mind, Margaret felt the first tremor of a truth she couldn't name. Dignity won at such a cost might be no dignity at all. Rain lashed the penthouse windows, a relentless shroud over Manhattan's glittering skyline. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the fireplace's glow casting long shadows across the marble floor. Lily Hale stood in the center of the room, her hoodie soaked from the storm outside, her dark hair clinging to her tear-streaked face. In her hands, she clutched a silver ring, small, worn, its surface etched with faint scratches. Sam stood opposite her, his coat dripping onto the rug, his hazel eyes steady but heavy with a truth he'd carried too long. You can't leave, Lily said, her voice raw, breaking the silence. Not now. Not after everything. She held up the ring, its glint catching the firelight. This was hers, wasn't it? Mom's. I remember her talking about it, something she gave away to someone she loved. Sam's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He stepped closer, his worn shoes silent against the polished floor. Lily, he said, his tone soft, yet firm, you don't need to do this. I didn't come here for her or for this. He gestured faintly at the opulence around them, the chandeliers and art pieces that screamed Haile Couture's wealth. Then why, she demanded, her voice rising, why stay with me? Why bring me bread, sit with me, act like you care? If you're my brother, if she's your mother, why won't you fight for her to see you? Sam exhaled, a slow, measured breath that held years of restraint. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded letter, yellowed, creased, the last he'd ever written. Because she made her choice, he said, unfolding it with care. And I made mine. I wrote this 10 years ago, after I stopped hoping she'd come back. Mom, I don't need you to love me. Just don't forget me. She forgot anyway. Lily took the letter, her fingers trembling as she read the words. Her tears fell, smudging the ink, but she didn't stop. She didn't forget, she whispered. She kept them. All your letters, She hid them, but they're here. Sam's calm faltered for the first time, a flicker of pain crossing his face. He turned away, staring at the rain-streaked glass. Keeping them doesn't mean remembering, he said. It means burying them. Like she buried me. Like she buried Ellen. The name hit Lily like a jolt. Ellen? She asked, stepping closer. Who's Ellen? Sam's voice dropped, a quiet storm of its own. My mother. My real mother. The one who raised me when Margaret walked away. She loved your mom once. Trusted her. Gave her that ring as a promise they'd stay together. Build a life, not just for them, but for me. He paused, his hands clenching briefly before relaxing. Margaret left us in Brooklyn with nothing but that promise. And when Ellen got sick, cancer, no money for treatment. She wrote to her, begged her to help. Margaret tore it up. Ellen died waiting. Lily's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth. The ring slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. No, she said, shaking her head. She wouldn't. She couldn't. She did, Sam said, his voice steady, not bitter, not angry, just true. I was 12 when Ellen died. I found the pieces of that letter in the trash after Margaret sent someone to clear out our apartment. She didn't even come herself. I stopped writing for a while after that, but I started again, hoping maybe she'd see me someday. She never did. The room spun around Lily, the penthouse's luxury mocking her mother's legacy. She sank to her knees, picking up the ring, its weight a condemnation. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Why didn't you hate her? Sam knelt beside her, his presence a quiet pillar amid her collapse. Hate doesn't fix anything, he said. It doesn't bring Ellen back, doesn't change what Margaret chose. I came here for you, Lily, not her. When I saw the crash on the news, I couldn't let you sit alone like I did when Ellen left me. You're worth more than her choices. Back at the hospital, Margaret sat alone, the scattered letters still littering the floor from Lily's exit. Her chest ached, not just from the crash, but from a wound older, deeper. She'd sent Claire and Richard away, needing silence to rebuild her walls. But the quiet betrayed her. A security tablet on the bedside table buzzed, its screen flickering to life with footage from the penthouse, Lily's plea, Sam's revelation, the ring. She watched, frozen, as Sam's words cut through the feed. She tore it up. Ellen died waiting. The memory crashed over her. Ellen's letter, its desperate scrawl, the photo of a frail Sam tucked inside. She'd ripped it apart in her office, hands shaking, whispering, I can't be weak. She'd locked it away, convinced her Danach, do her honor demanded it. But now, seeing Sam's face, hearing his calm, unflinching truth, that honor felt like ash. Her fingers found a letter on the bed. I don't blame you. And clutched it tight. Ellen's face flashed in her mind, steady, warm, trusting, dying, because Margaret chose pride over love. Sam's face followed, those hazel eyes, reaching, for her then and now, never with anger, only with a dignity she'd never earned. I killed them both, she whispered, her voice breaking, tears spilling for the first time in decades. My honor, my pride, I killed them. The ring on the screen gleamed, a silent witness to her betrayal, and the weight of it crushed her. She'd controlled everything, her emotions, her empire, to preserve her famgia. But it was a lie. True dignity wasn't in her crown. It was in Sam's quiet stand, in Ellen's sacrifice, in Lily's tears. The rain outside slowed, but inside, Margaret's world unraveled. She pressed the letter to her chest, sobbing into the sterile silence, a queen humbled not by force, but by the truth she could no longer deny. The grand atrium of Hale Couture's headquarters gleamed under a constellation of chandeliers, their crystal facets scattering light across marble walls. A sea of reporters filled the space, cameras flashing like a storm of stars, their lenses trained on the podium where Margaret Hale stood. 2 days after waking from her coma, she'd insisted on this press conference. Her silver hair swept into a flawless chignon, her navy suit crisp despite the faint tremor in her hands. The world watched, hungry for her next move, while behind her, A massive screen glowed with the Hail Couture logo, a symbol of her unyielding reign. Richard Klein lingered at the edge of the stage, his tailored suit a smug armor, his eyes glinting with anticipation. He'd spent the morning whispering to the board, stoking their fears. She's weak now, sentimental. We can't afford this. Claire stood nearby, tablet in hand, her face taut with the strain of managing a crisis spiraling beyond control. And in the wings, hidden from the crowd, Lily waited, her hoodie swapped for a simple black dress, her hands clutching Sam's last letter. Mom, I don't need you to love me. Just don't forget me. Margaret gripped the podium, her knuckles white, her breath steady despite the storm within. She'd faced the press 1,000 times, crises of design, scandals of finance, but never like this. The headlines had morphed since the crash. Mystery man tied to Hale heiress. Margaret's secret shame. Richard had handed her a script. Deny him. End it. And she'd held it all the way here. A lifeline to her old self, but his eye. And gentlemen, she began, her voice cutting through the murmurs firm as ever. I'm here to set the record straight. Hail Couture remains strong. I remain strong. The crash was a setback, nothing more. A reporter shouted from the front row. What about the man with your daughter? Is he after your fortune? The crowd buzzed, cameras clicking, and Richard's smirk widened. Margaret's gaze flickered to Lily in the wings, her daughter's eyes locked on her, pleading, accusing, hoping. She saw the letter in Lily's hands, felt its echo in her own chest. Don't forget me. Then Sam's face rose in her mind, those hazel eyes, steady through years of silence, his quiet dignity in the penthouse footage she'd watched, alone. And Ellen's bread, her plea, her death, pressed against her like a weight she couldn't shed. Richard stepped closer, his voice low, venomous. Stick to the script, Margaret. Tell them he's nothing, a con, a leech, or I'll tell the board you've lost it. They'll vote you out by morning. The threat was a blade, sharp and familiar. She'd built her Danate due, her honor, on. Never bending, never breaking. To admit Sam was to unravel it all, her legacy, her control, her empire. The board would turn, the stock would plummet, and Richard would claim her throne. She lifted the script, her fingers tracing the typed lies. He is no one to me, but Lily's gaze held her unyielding. Margaret saw the ring in her mind, silver, scratched, a promise she'd broken. She saw Ellen's letter, torn and discarded, and Sam's bread, offered without demand. Her honor had been a fortress, cold and solitary, built on sacrifices she'd called strength. Yet Sam's quiet stand, Lily's tears, they spoke of a dignity she'd never grasped, one not forged in power, but in love. She let the script fall, the paper fluttering to the floor like a shed skin. The room hushed, a collective intake of breath. Richard's eyes narrowed, but Margaret straightened, her voice rising, clear and unshaken. His name is Sam, she said, each word deliberate, a hammer striking stone. And he's my son. The atrium erupted, gasps, shouts, cameras flashing in a frenzy. Richard lunged forward, his face twisting. You're finished, Margaret. The board won't stand for this. Honor isn't what you think, she cut in, her gaze locking on his, calm and piercing. It's not money, not power, not your games. I left a boy behind to build this company. I ignored his mother's plea when she needed me most. I thought that was strength. I was wrong. She turned to the crowd, her voice steady despite the chaos. I've lost a son once because of my pride. I won't lose him again. Or my daughter. Lily stepped from the wings, tears streaming, and ran to her, throwing her arms around her mother. The cameras caught it all, the embrace, the letters still clutched in Lily's hand, the raw humanity of a queen unthroned. Richard stormed off, barking threats, but his voice drowned in the uproar. Margaret held Lily close, her composure cracking as she whispered, I'm sorry. She looked out at the crowd, searching, and found him. Sam, standing at the back, half hidden in the throng. His coat was damp, his face unreadable, but his eyes met hers. No anger, no triumph, just a quiet nod, a recognition of her choice. He turned then, slipping through the crowd toward the exit, his figure fading into the shadows beyond the lights. Margaret's heart clenched. He wasn't staying, wasn't claiming her, but she understood. He'd come for Lily, not for her, and his dignity didn't need her validation. The reporters surged, questions flying. Who is he? What does this mean for Hale Couture? Margaret raised a hand, silencing them with a look honed over decades. It means I'm still here, she said, and I'll face whatever comes, with my family. The chandeliers glittered above, but their light felt dimmer now, overshadowed by a truth laid bare. Margaret had chosen, not the script, not the crown, but a femme gia deeper than she'd known. Richard would fight, the board would rage, and the empire might falter. But as Lily's arms tightened around her, she felt a strength she'd never claimed, one born not of control, but of surrender to what mattered most. Outside, the rain eased, and Sam stepped into the night, his silhouette lost to the city. Inside, Margaret stood tall, her honor redefined, not by the lights, but by the truth she'd finally spoken. The penthouse was gone, its glass walls and marble floors traded for a modest brownstone on the edge of Brooklyn. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, dusting the wooden kitchen table with gold. Margaret Hale stood at the counter, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her hands kneading dough, a simple bread recipe she'd pieced together from memory. The scent of yeast filled the air, warm and grounding, a far cry from the sterile luxury of her old life. At 62, she was no longer the queen of Hale Couture, but she felt lighter than she ever had. Lily sat at the table, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, a sketchbook open before her. She was 18 now, a year past the crash that had unraveled their world, and her pencil moved with quiet purpose, drawing a dress, simple yet elegant, a dream taking shape. The wooden box of Sam's letters rested beside her, its lid worn but cherished, a silent testament to the past they'd reclaimed. The press conference had been a reckoning. Margaret's words, "He's my son," had sparked a firestorm. Richard Klein had rallied the board, forcing a vote that stripped her of her CEO title within days. The stock plummeted. Headlines screamed, "Hale Couture's fall from grace," and the empire she'd built crumbled under the weight of her truth. She'd walked away, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a calm she hadn't known she possessed. She'd sold the penthouse, let go of the wealth and moved here, to a place where the air smelled of earth, not ambition. "Smells good," Lily said, glancing up with a small smile. "Better than my cookies anyway." Margaret chuckled, a sound rare and unguarded. "Ellen's recipe," she said, shaping the dough into a loaf. "She used to make it every Sunday. I watched her once, thought I'd never need to learn." Her voice softened, tinged with a regret she no longer hid. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Lily set her pencil down, her eyes meeting her. Mother's. "You're learning now," she said. "That's what counts." The bread went into the oven, and Margaret sat across from her daughter, her hands dusted with flour. She reached for a notepad beside her, a letter she'd been drafting to Sam. The words were halting, imperfect. "I don't expect forgiveness, Sam. I just want you to know I'm trying. To be the mother I should have been. To Lily, at least. You taught me what honor really means." She hadn't sent it yet, hadn't found his address, but writing it felt like a step toward the femme gia she'd lost. "Do you think he'll read it?" Lily asked, her voice quiet. She traced the edge of the box, her fingers lingering on the ring inside. Silver, scratched, a relic of promises broken and remade. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, her gaze steady. "He doesn't owe me anything. He never did. But I owe him this, acknowledging him, even if he never sees it." Lily nodded, a flicker of pride in her eyes. "He'd be proud of you, Mom. Not the old you, the one who stood up that day, the one who's here now." The words settled over Margaret like dawn after a long night. She'd faced Richard's taunts, the board's betrayal, the world's scorn, and she'd held her ground, not with fists or fury, but with a quiet strength she'd learned from Sam. She'd lost her crown, but found something truer, a dignity, not in titles but in accountability, in love. The oven dinged and Margaret rose, pulling the bread free. Its crust was golden, cracked just like Ellen's, and the sight stung her eyes with unshed tears. She set it on the table, cutting a slice for Lily, then one for herself. They ate in silence, the warmth of the bread a bridge between them. Simple, real, a taste of home she'd once forsaken. "I'm starting something new," Margaret said after a moment, her voice steady. "A fund, for kids like Sam, ones left behind. Not with Hale money, just what I've got left. It's not much, but it's a start." Lily's face lit up, her sketchbook forgotten. "That's amazing, Mom. He'd like that." Margaret smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. "I hope so. It's not about fixing the past. Can't do that. It's about carrying it forward, doing right where I went wrong." The morning stretched on, sunlight spilling over the brownstone's worn floors. Lily sketched, Margaret wrote, and the bread sat between them, a quiet symbol of a life rebuilt. The city buzzed beyond their walls, Hale Couture's shadow fading into memory. But here, in this small space, they were enough. Later, Lily slipped the ring onto her finger, twirling it absently. "He'll come back someday," she said, her voice soft but certain. "When he's ready. He'll see what you've done." Margaret looked at her daughter, then at the letter, her hand resting on the paper. "I don't need him to come back," she said. "I just need him to know I'm here, really here, trying to be the mother he deserved, and the one you deserve." Lily reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "You already are," she said, her voice breaking with a smile. Outside, the sun climbed higher, painting Brooklyn in hues of gold. Margaret took a breath, tasting the bread, feeling the weight of her choices lift, just a little. She'd lost an empire, but gained a family, not perfect, not whole, but hers. Her dench due, her honor, was no longer a fortress, but a garden. Tended with care, rooted in sacrifice and love. The city moved on, its headlines shifting to new scandals, new kings. But in that brownstone, Margaret Hale sat with her daughter, her past laid bare, her future uncertain but bright. She'd fallen, yes, but she'd risen too, not as a queen, but as a woman who'd learned what dignity truly meant. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final glow over the city she'd once ruled. She stood at the window, breadcrumbs, still on her fingers, her daughter's laughter echoing behind her. It wasn't the ending she'd imagined, no crowns, no headlines, but it was hers, earned through every tear, every truth. Honor wasn't a throne. It was this moment, quiet and real. A life rebuilt from the ashes of pride. If this journey of resilience and redemption moved you, please give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. There's more to come. Stories of strength, heart, and hope.